The tribunal was not called because of war. Wars were expected. Wars were manageable. Wars followed rules the galaxy had spent millennia refining into something predictable, something survivable. This was different. Entire fleets did not vanish without a trace. Entire command structures did not collapse into silence mid-transmission. And yet, that was exactly what had happened. 3 hours ago, the 7th Dominion Armada, one of the most advanced and heavily defended military forces in known space, entered a system marked only by a minor human advisory notice. The message had been filed decades earlier, buried in a bureaucratic archive under non-critical warnings, categorized as unverified environmental instability. It had not even triggered a review. Now, there was nothing left of the Armada. No debris, no wreckage, no energy signatures consistent with weapons fire. Just a sudden, absolute loss of contact, followed by a single corrupted transmission that repeated across every emergency channel before cutting out entirely. We were not attacked. That was the last coherent statement received. The rest of the message fractured into something unintelligible, coordinates that looped back on themselves, identifiers that no longer matched any known registry, and finally, a phrase that analysts could not classify as either language or error. It noticed us. At first, the Dominion assumed sabotage. Then they assumed a hidden weapon. Then they did what no empire had done in over 1,000 cycles. They called for judgment. Now, representatives from across the galaxy filled the chamber, their attention fixed on a single figure standing at the center of the tribunal floor. The human envoy did not appear distressed. He did not appear defensive. If anything, he seemed tired, in a way that suggested this moment had been anticipated long before anyone else realized it was coming. A projection flickered to life above the chamber, displaying the recovered logs from the Armada's final approach. The footage showed nothing unusual at first: standard formation, stable readings, a routine advance into what should have been an empty system. Then, without warning, the data began to drift. Time stamps desynchronized. Navigation markers shifted by fractional degrees, then by kilometers, then by impossible distances that could not exist within mapped space. The fleet did not react. They continued forward as if nothing had changed. "Explain this," the presiding arbiter demanded, their voice carrying the controlled fury of a civilization that had just lost something it could not afford to lose. The human did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked up at the projection, his expression unreadable as the final moments of the Armada played out in looping silence. Ships flickered, not physically, but conceptually, as though their presence in the data stream could no longer be consistently defined. One by one, they ceased to register, not destroyed, not disengaged, simply absent. When the last signal vanished, the chamber fell into a silence, so complete it felt unnatural. Then the human spoke. "You were warned." The words were not delivered as an accusation. They were not raised in anger or sharpened with defiance. They were quiet, almost procedural, as if he were reciting a line from a document that had already been filed and forgotten. The arbiter's response was immediate. That notice was classified as non-hostile environmental risk. It did not indicate. "It wasn't a threat," the human interrupted, his tone unchanged. "It was a boundary." A ripple of confusion moved through the chamber. Boundaries were enforced. Boundaries were defended. Boundaries did not erase fleets without resistance. "Then what crossed it?" another delegate demanded, their voice edged with something dangerously close to fear. For the first time, the human hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer itself seemed insufficient. Finally, he exhaled, the sound carrying a weight that did not belong in a room designed for power and control. "You didn't cross into a restricted zone," he said. "You crossed into containment." The word landed harder than any accusation. Containment implied something had been held. Something had been restrained, isolated, prevented from interacting with the wider galaxy. It implied intention, design, responsibility. It implied failure. Contained what? The Arbiter pressed, their composure beginning to fracture. The humans' gaze shifted from the projection to the assembled leaders, as if weighing how much of the truth they were capable of understanding in a single moment. Then, with the same quiet certainty, he answered, "Not a weapon." Another pause, something we couldn't destroy. The chamber stirred, voices rising in overlapping demands for clarification, for explanation, for accountability. But the human did not raise his voice to meet them. He simply stood there, unmoving, as the noise built around him. And then he said the one thing that silenced them all. "We didn't lose control of it today." His eyes flickered back to the fading projection of the vanished fleet. "We lost control of it the moment you made it aware of you." The implications settled slowly, like something too large to be processed all at once. If the Armada had not been attacked, if the system had not been a weapon, then the question that remained was far worse than anything the Tribunal had prepared for. What exactly had humanity been holding back, and why had it just started paying attention? For several long seconds after the human spoke, no one in the Tribunal moved. It was not hesitation. It was something closer to recalculation, the collective instinct of civilizations that had survived by understanding threats before reacting to them. But this was not a threat they could define. Containment implied scale. It implied duration. It implied that humanity, young, erratic, frequently underestimated humanity, had been holding something in place that the rest of the galaxy had never even noticed. And now it was gone. The Arbiter recovered first, their voice tightening into something sharper, more controlled, as if authority alone could restore order to a situation that had already slipped beyond it. "You are claiming," they said slowly, "that your species has been maintaining containment of an unknown phenomenon capable of erasing a Dominion fleet without disclosure." The human did not argue the phrasing. Yes. No justification. No elaboration. Just confirmation. The chamber erupted. Delegates spoke over one another, accusations layered with disbelief, outrage clashing with something far less stable. Entire empires had risen and fallen on less than this. The idea that a single species, one that had only recently joined interstellar governance, had withheld something of this magnitude was not just a breach of protocol. It was a violation of trust on a scale that destabilized the very concept of shared security. But beneath the anger, something else was forming. A question no one wanted to ask directly. Why would they hide it? The Arbiter raised a hand, silencing the chamber through force of presence alone. When they spoke again, the edge in their voice had shifted. Less outrage, more calculation. "You had channels," they said. "Oversight committees. Joint threat assessments. You chose not to report this." The human nodded once. "We reported it exactly as it needed to be reported." A flicker of confusion crossed several faces. "That designation," the human continued, gesturing toward the archived advisory notice now displayed in the air, "was not an error. It was intentional. Non-hostile environmental instability." A delegate repeated, incredulous. "You expect us to believe that classification was accurate?" It was the only classification that wouldn't trigger interference. The statement landed harder than any admission of guilt. Interference. The implication was immediate. Humanity had not been hiding the threat to protect themselves. They had been hiding it to protect everyone else. The Tribunal did not accept that explanation. Not yet. Not without proof. "Clarify," the Arbiter demanded. For a moment, it seemed as though the human might refuse. His posture remained unchanged, but there was a shift in his expression. A brief, almost imperceptible tightening that suggested the next words were not part of the prepared response. Then, without looking away, he spoke. It reacts to attention. Silence returned, but this time it was different. Not confusion. Recognition. Because every advanced civilization in that chamber understood what it meant for something to react to observation. Entire branches of science had been built around that principle, but those effects were limited, controlled, observable within defined parameters. Not this. You're suggesting, the Arbiter said carefully, that the presence of the Dominion fleet triggered a response simply by being there. Not just being there, the human replied, by looking. A ripple of unease spread through the chamber, subtle but undeniable. Observation changes the system, one of the scientific delegates muttered, almost to themselves. But not at this scale. Not usually, the human agreed. The projection shifted, pulling up earlier logs. Records not from the Dominion fleet, but from older, less prominent expeditions. Small survey teams, independent probes, minor incursions that had been dismissed as navigational anomalies or data corruption. Each one had entered the same region. Each one had experienced distortions. Each one had withdrawn before escalation. They never stayed long enough, the human said. They noticed something was wrong, and they left. That was enough. And the Dominion? The Arbiter pressed. They didn't leave. The answer was simple. Too simple. So it reacted. Another delegate said, their voice tight. That still doesn't explain the disappearance of an entire fleet. The human's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the speaker, but toward the projection, as if the answer was embedded in the data itself. They didn't disappear, he said. That drew immediate attention. They were still there, he continued, his voice steady. Right up until the point they weren't. That is not an explanation. No, the human agreed. It's a description. Frustration flared again, sharper this time, edged with fear that no longer bothered to hide behind protocol. Then explain it properly. The human was quiet for a moment, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully. When we first encountered it, he said, we thought it was a spatial anomaly. Then we thought it was temporal. Then we realized neither of those frameworks applied. He paused, just long enough for the weight of what came next to settle. It doesn't interact with space or time the way we do. The chamber leaned in, collectively, as if proximity could make the concept easier to grasp. It interacts with definition, the human said. The word hung in the air, vague and insufficient, yet somehow more unsettling than anything more precise could have been. Objects, systems, identities. Everything we perceive exists because it is defined. It has boundaries, properties, consistency. He gestured toward the vanished fleet. It removes those. A chill moved through the chamber, quiet but absolute. Not by destroying them, he continued, but by making them less certain. No one spoke. No one interrupted, because for the first time, they were beginning to understand. Not fully, not completely, but enough. The fleet didn't get attacked, the human said. It got undefined. The word felt wrong, incomplete, but it fit too well to dismiss. And you contained this, the Arbiter said, their voice lower now, stripped of its earlier authority. For how long? The human didn't hesitate. 83 years. A murmur spread through the chamber, not loud, not chaotic, but heavy with implication. 83 years of silence. 83 years of restraint. 83 years of holding something in place that could erase entire fleets without firing a single shot. How? Someone asked, the question slipping out before it could be contained. The human looked at them, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not pride, not fear, something closer to exhaustion. We didn't fight it, he said. That alone was enough to unsettle them. We learned what it ignores. A pause, a shift, and then we became that. The chamber went still again, because that answer didn't resolve anything. It made everything worse. If humanity had not contained the anomaly through force, if they had not suppressed it, neutralized it, or destroyed it, then what exactly had they turned themselves into to keep it from noticing them? And more importantly, what happens now that it has? The silence that followed did not break this time. It deepened, not because the tribunal had no questions left, but because the answers were beginning to form on their own, and none of them led anywhere stable. Humanity had not built a wall. They had not deployed a weapon. They had not even attempted to control the phenomenon in any conventional sense. They had adapted to it. That realization spread slowly through the chamber, unsettling in its simplicity. Every advanced civilization understood adaptation as a survival strategy. You learned the rules of your environment, and you adjusted accordingly. But this was not an environment. This was something that erased the very rules themselves. And humanity had still found a way to exist within it. How? The Arbiter asked again. But this time the question was different. Less demand, more necessity. The human did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured, and the projection shifted once more. The new data did not show fleets or anomalies. It showed Earth, not as it was now, but as it had been decades earlier. Dense with activity, saturated with signals, every channel filled with the noise of a species that had only recently discovered how loud it could be. Communication networks overlapped, data streams collided, and information moved with chaotic inefficiency. Then, gradually something changed. The noise began to thin. At first, it was subtle. Redundant transmissions disappeared. Overlapping signals were consolidated. Entire categories of data that had once been considered essential were quietly removed or reduced. The network became cleaner, quieter, more structured. But it did not stop there. Further into the timeline, the reduction became more aggressive. Civilian broadcasts were limited. Private networks were isolated. Entire sections of planetary communication infrastructure were shut down, not due to failure, but by design. The density of observable information dropped below what any advanced species would consider sustainable. Information discipline. A delegate murmured, recognizing the pattern. The human inclined his head slightly. That was the first step. The projection accelerated, showing similar patterns across human space. Colonies followed the same trajectory. Data output decreased. Signal clarity increased. Redundancy was eliminated. What remained was not silence, but precision. Every transmission deliberate. Every system operating within tightly controlled parameters. You reduced your own visibility, the Arbiter said. Yes. To avoid detection. The human paused, then shook his head. Not exactly. That answer drew immediate attention. Detection wasn't the problem, he continued. Interpretation was. The chamber shifted again, unease returning in a more focused form. When we first encountered it, we assumed it reacted to presence, the human said. So we minimized ours, reduced emissions, limited movement, cut back on anything that might draw attention. And that worked, someone asked. For a while. The projection flickered, transitioning to a series of early incident reports, small teams, isolated failures, moments where the anomaly had interacted with human systems despite their reduced activity. We realized something quickly, the human said. It wasn't looking for us. A pause. It was trying to understand us. The implication landed harder than anything before it, and we were giving it too much to work with. The projection shifted again, this time showing internal human research logs, fragments of analysis that had been declassified just enough to be displayed, models of the phenomenon's behavior, simulations that attempted to map its interactions with defined systems, and a recurring conclusion that appeared in multiple formats, across multiple teams. Consistency increases vulnerability. The human let the words hang there. "We define ourselves constantly," he said. "Every signal, every action, every piece of data reinforces what we are. It creates a stable identity." Another pause. "And stable identities are easy to process." The chamber was beginning to understand. Not fully, not comfortably, but enough. "So you made yourselves unstable," the Arbiter said, the words coming slowly, as if forcing them into existence required effort. The human's expression shifted slightly. Not quite agreement, not quite correction. "We made ourselves inconsistent." The difference mattered. Inconsistent systems are harder to model, harder to predict, harder to simplify. The last word carried weight now, informed by everything that had been revealed. "And that's what it does," the Arbiter said. "It simplifies." "Yes." "To the point of removal." "Yes." Silence returned again, but this time it was accompanied by something else. Understanding. Uneasy. Incomplete. But real. "You didn't hide from it," a delegate said quietly. "You confused it." The human did not respond immediately. Then, finally, "We became something it couldn't define cleanly." The projection shifted one last time. This time, it showed the restricted zone, not as a map, not as coordinates, but as a boundary defined by absence. A region where data behaved differently, where signals degraded in ways that did not follow any known pattern. At its center, a faint distortion pulsed, barely visible, as if reality itself struggled to maintain coherence around it. And around that distortion, human systems, not dense, not concentrated, sparse, irregular, scattered in patterns that made no strategic sense, positioned not for defense or expansion, but for something far more specific. Interference. "You didn't contain it with walls," the Arbiter said, the realization settling into place. "No, you surrounded it with noise." The human shook his head. "Not noise." Another pause. Contradiction. The word echoed through the chamber, heavier now, more defined. "You created a field of inconsistent data," another delegate said, piecing it together. "A system it couldn't resolve." "Yes, and that kept it stable. For 83 years. The number felt different now. Not just a measure of time, but a measure of effort, of discipline, of a species choosing to limit itself, to restrain its own growth, its own expression, to maintain a balance that no one else had even been aware of. "Until the Dominion fleet arrived," the Arbiter said. The human's gaze returned to the projection, where the final moments of the Armada looped silently. "They didn't follow the pattern," he said. "They didn't need to. They brought certainty." The word cut through the chamber like a blade. A fleet, that large, that organized, that precise. It was the opposite of inconsistency. Every movement defined, every system aligned, every action reinforcing a singular, coherent identity to something that simplified. It was perfect. They gave it something it could understand, the human said. And once it understood them. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The chamber sat in that silence, the implications settling into something heavier, more dangerous. Because if the Dominion fleet had triggered the failure simply by being too defined, then the question that followed was unavoidable. What happens when something that simplifies everything finally learns how to define humanity? The question did not need to be spoken aloud for it to take hold of the chamber. It spread in silence, moving from one mind to another, reshaping the way every delegate in that room now viewed the situation. For 83 years, humanity had survived not by strength, not by superiority, but by remaining unresolved, by existing in a state that resisted definition, that blurred the edges of identity just enough to remain outside the phenomenon's reach. And now something had changed. The Arbiter was the first to push forward, their voice carrying a new edge, not anger this time, but urgency. If it has learned from the Dominion fleet, they said, then your method no longer works. The human did not answer immediately. That hesitation was all the confirmation they needed. A ripple of tension moved through the chamber, sharper now, more focused. This was no longer about blame or secrecy. This was about failure, imminent, cascading, impossible to contain once it began. How long? A delegate asked, their composure slipping just enough to reveal the fear beneath it. How long before it adapts to your contradictions? The human's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the speaker, but toward the projection, where the restricted zone pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly. It already has, he said. The words landed without impact at first. Then they settled, and everything changed. What do you mean? The arbiter demanded, the restraint in their voice beginning to fracture. The projection flickered again, pulling up new data. Live feeds, not archived records. Signals from the edge of the restricted zone, where human interference patterns had once held steady for decades. They were no longer steady. The irregularity that had defined them, the carefully maintained inconsistencies, the contradictions layered into every transmission, was beginning to align. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. What you're seeing, the human said, is pattern recognition. The chamber leaned in, every attention fixed on the shifting data. For 83 years, we fed it contradictions, he continued. Overlapping signals, inconsistent outputs, systems that behaved differently under identical conditions. It couldn't resolve them, so it ignored them. A pause. But now, the projection zoomed in, isolating a cluster of human systems at the boundary. Their signals, once chaotic, now exhibited faint traces of repetition. Subtle consistencies where none should exist. Predictable variations within previously unpredictable ranges. It's learning how we're inconsistent, the human said. The implication hit instantly, and once it can predict that, a delegate began. It can define us anyway, the arbiter finished. Yes. Silence fell again, but this time it was not empty. It was heavy with inevitability. Then containment is already lost, someone said, their voice barely above a whisper. The human did not correct them. He didn't need to. The projection shifted once more, expanding outward from the restricted zone. For the first time, the anomaly's influence was visible beyond its original boundary, not as a sudden expansion, but as a gradual bleed. Signals from nearby systems showed minor distortions. Navigation data flickered. Identity markers in communication logs began to drift, small inconsistencies appearing where none had been before. It was subtle, but it was spreading. You said it reacts to observation, the arbiter said, their voice tightening again, this time with controlled urgency. Then why is it expanding now? No fleet has entered the zone. The human exhaled slowly, as if the answer was something he had hoped not to say out loud, because now it's observing us. The chamber froze, not physically, conceptually. Every delegate in that room, every system connected to the tribunal, every network receiving this transmission. Suddenly, they were no longer observers. They were participants. You told us it reacts to being looked at, a delegate said, their voice strained. Not to looking. We were wrong, the human replied. The correction was quiet, devastating. It doesn't just respond to observation, he continued. It learns from it. Every attempt to analyze it, every model, every simulation, we've been feeding its structure. The realization spread like a shockwave. All the data, all the analysis, all the attention directed at the phenomenon since the Dominion fleet vanished. They hadn't been studying it. They had been teaching it. You mean, the arbiter began, then stopped, as if completing the thought would make it real. The human did it for them. We've made it better at understanding us. The projection flickered violently now, not from external interference, but from internal inconsistency. Systems attempting to process the incoming data began to desynchronize, their outputs conflicting as they struggled to reconcile the implications. "Shut it down," someone said suddenly. "All of it. Stop the analysis. Cut the feeds." "It's too late," the human interrupted. The words were not harsh. They didn't need to be. "It doesn't need direct observation anymore," he said. "It has enough data to extrapolate." A pause, and now it knows where to look. The projection shifted again, this time pulling up a map of human space. Points of light marked key systems, colonies, infrastructure hubs. Then, one by one, they began to flicker. Not vanish. Not yet. But shift. Coordinates drifting by fractional degrees. Identity markers failing to resolve cleanly. Data packets arriving with subtle inconsistencies that grew more pronounced with each passing second. "It's starting," the human said. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in motion. Commands were issued. Systems were rerouted. Emergency protocols activated across multiple civilizations at once. The instinct to act overrode the paralysis of uncertainty. But beneath it all, one question remained. "What do we do?" the arbiter demanded, turning back to the human. For the first time since the tribunal began, there was no immediate answer. The human stood there, watching the map as more points began to flicker, his expression no longer unreadable, but resolved. Then slowly he spoke. "We stop pretending this is containment." The chamber stilled again. "Then what is it?" the arbiter pressed. The human's gaze did not leave the projection. "It's escalation." The word carried weight now. Finality. And there's only one way we've ever dealt with something that learns from us faster than we can control it. A pause. A shift. Not in tone. In meaning. We let it learn everything. The chamber went silent once more, but this time not out of confusion. Out of fear. Because if humanity was about to stop holding back, then whatever came next would not be something the galaxy could survive by running from. And for the first time since the Dominion fleet disappeared, a new, far more dangerous question emerged. What exactly happens when humanity stops trying to be undefined and chooses to be fully known? The reaction was immediate, and it was absolute. "You can't be serious." The words came from more than one voice, layered in disbelief, rejection, and something dangerously close to panic. Entire civilizations had just watched a phenomenon evolve from incomprehensible to catastrophic in a matter of hours, and now the species that had held it back for nearly a century was proposing to do the exact opposite of everything that had worked. The arbiter did not raise their voice, but the pressure behind it was unmistakable. "Clarify your intent," they said, "because what you are suggesting sounds indistinguishable from surrender." The human did not look at them. He was still watching the projection, where human systems continued to flicker, their once controlled inconsistencies collapsing into patterns the anomaly could now follow. The map no longer represented territory. It represented time. "How long do we have?" he asked instead. The question caught the chamber off guard. "You are not in a position to." "How long?" the human repeated, and this time there was something in his tone that cut through protocol and authority alike. Not defiance. Certainty. The arbiter hesitated, then signaled for an update. Data streams shifted, calculations running across multiple predictive models simultaneously. The results converged faster than expected. 17 hours before full systemic destabilization in your outer colonies, they said. 31 before it reaches your core systems. A pause, and after that, projection failure. The human nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. "Then we don't have time for alternatives." The chamber stirred again, but this time the tension was different. Not outrage, not confusion. Recognition. He wasn't proposing a risk. He was stating a necessity. "You're suggesting we expose it to more data," a delegate said carefully, trying to frame the idea in terms that could be analyzed. More variables, more complexity. Overload its capacity to simplify. The human shook his head. That's what we've been doing. Another pause. It's already adapting. The projection flickered again, showing a cluster of human systems near the boundary. Their signals, once layered with contradiction, were now being resolved, simplified, reduced into stable patterns that the anomaly could process without resistance. What we gave it before was noise, the human continued. Inconsistency without context. It couldn't interpret it, so it ignored it. And now it can, the arbiter said. Yes. Then increasing the volume will only accelerate the process. Yes. Silence fell again, because the logic led nowhere survivable. If more doesn't work, the arbiter said slowly, and less doesn't work, then what exactly are you proposing? The human finally turned, not toward the arbiter, but toward the chamber as a whole, as if addressing not just the leaders present, but every system connected to the tribunal, every civilization now watching the unraveling of something they had never known existed. We're not going to give it more data, he said. A pause. We're going to give it meaning. The word hung there, heavier than anything before it. Meaning was not a measurable quantity. It was not something that could be quantified, categorized, or reduced to a set of variables. It was interpretation, context, the relationship between information and understanding. And that was the one thing the anomaly did not have. You said it simplifies, a delegate said, their voice tight with concentration. Reduces everything to a consistent state. Yes. Then meaning is exactly what it removes. Yes. Then how does giving it meaning help? The human's expression shifted again, not into confidence, but into something far more dangerous. Clarity, because it's not removing meaning on purpose, he said. The chamber stilled. It's removing it because it doesn't know how to hold it. The implication hit instantly, reframing everything that had come before. The anomaly wasn't destroying identity. It was failing to process it. It's not a weapon, the arbiter said slowly, the realization forming piece by piece. It's a system trying to integrate everything it encounters. Yes, and it simplifies, because that's the only way it can remain stable. Yes. Another pause. Then if we give it something too complex to simplify, the delegate began. It destabilizes, the human finished. The chamber leaned forward, the pieces finally beginning to align into something actionable. But you've already been doing that, the arbiter said. You've been feeding it contradictions for decades. The human nodded, and it learned to ignore them. A shift, what it hasn't learned to do. He let the sentence hang, just long enough for the weight of it to settle, is experience them. Silence, not confusion this time. Comprehension. You're not talking about data, the arbiter said. No, you're talking about consciousness. The word felt wrong in the context of strategy, but there was no better one. Yes. The chamber erupted again, but this time not in chaos, in argument, in rapid, overlapping analysis as the implications cascaded through every layer of understanding. You can't transfer consciousness at that scale. It would require total neural integration across. The instability alone would. It wouldn't survive the process. The human didn't interrupt. He waited, and when the noise reached its peak, he spoke again. It doesn't have to survive. That stopped them, completely, because that wasn't a flaw in the plan. It was the plan. You're not trying to preserve your species, the arbiter said, their voice barely above a whisper now. The human met their gaze. No. A pause. We're trying to finish the containment. The words landed with finality, not a proposal, a conclusion. You're going to let it absorb you, a delegate said, the realization breaking through the last layer of denial. Yes. And in doing so, you're going to force it to process everything that makes you human. Yes. Another pause. And if it fails? The human didn't hesitate. Then it breaks. The chamber fell silent one last time, because there it was, the real plan. Not a battle, not a defense, not even a containment strategy in the traditional sense. A forced transformation. You're turning yourselves into a system it can't survive integrating, the Arbiter said. Yes, and if it does survive? The question hung there, heavier than any before it, because the answer to that question would define the future of everything that still existed. The human held their gaze for a long moment, then quietly, then it won't be the same thing anymore. The implication was immediate, absolute. If the anomaly adapted, if it succeeded in integrating humanity instead of breaking under it, then whatever emerged on the other side would not just understand the galaxy, it would understand humanity completely. And for the first time since the plan began to take shape, a new fear settled into the chamber, not of what humanity was about to do, but of what they might create. The Arbiter's voice, when it came, was no longer commanding. It was uncertain, and you're willing to take that risk. The human didn't look away. We already did, he said. A pause. 83 years ago. And as the projection shifted once more, showing human systems beginning to synchronize, not into inconsistency, but into something far more structured, the final, unavoidable question emerged. What happens when a species that has spent decades hiding what it is decides to show it everything? The moment the decision was made, the shift was immediate and irreversible. Across human space, systems that had spent decades suppressing themselves began to wake up, not gradually, not cautiously. Entire networks that had been deliberately fragmented, throttled, and distorted for the sake of inconsistency suddenly aligned with a precision that felt almost violent in its clarity. Data streams that once contradicted each other now synchronized. Communication channels that had been reduced to minimal output surged back to full capacity. Humanity was no longer hiding. It was becoming visible. The projection within the tribunal chamber struggled to keep up as the map of human-controlled space transformed in real time. Points of light that had flickered uncertainly moments before now stabilized, locking into place with perfect coherence. Signals sharpened, identities resolved. Systems that had once resisted definition now declared themselves fully, completely, and at the boundary, the anomaly responded, not with aggression, with focus. The distortion that had once drifted aimlessly within its containment field began to narrow, its influence concentrating, as if drawn toward the sudden clarity radiating from human space. Where before it had reacted passively to proximity and observation, now it moved with intent, subtle, precise, unmistakable. It was no longer trying to understand in fragments. It was targeting the whole. Inside the tribunal, silence returned once more, but this time it was laced with something far more immediate than fear. Witness. They were watching a species remove its own camouflage in front of something that had already proven capable of erasing entire civilizations simply by learning how they worked. "You're accelerating it," a delegate said, the realization cutting through the stillness. "By making yourselves coherent." "Yes," the human replied. There was no hesitation, no doubt. "You're giving it exactly what it needs to define you." "Yes." The simplicity of the answer was almost unbearable. "Then this isn't containment," the Arbiter said, their voice tight with controlled urgency. "This is exposure." The human's gaze remained fixed on the projection. It always was. The first outer colony went dark seconds later, not gradually, not with the flickering instability seen earlier. It simply resolved. Its signal flattened into a single, stable output, perfectly consistent, perfectly defined, and completely devoid of variation. Then, just as suddenly, it ceased to exist within the data stream entirely. A single, clean removal, no distortion, no resistance, The chamber reacted instantly, systems recalibrating, observers attempting to track the loss, to isolate the moment of failure, to understand what had just happened. They couldn't. There was nothing to analyze. It adapted, someone whispered. The human did not look away. Yes. Another system followed, then another, each one stabilizing briefly, locking into perfect definition before vanishing completely. The anomaly was no longer struggling with inconsistency. It was processing it, absorbing the clarity humanity had just revealed and using it to refine its method. You said this would destabilize it, the Arbiter said, the first hint of strain breaking through their composure. It will. Then why is it getting faster? The human exhaled slowly, the sound carrying a weight that no one in the chamber could ignore. Because this is the first phase. The words landed like a countdown. Phase of what? A delegate demanded. Understanding. The projection shifted again, zooming in on the boundary where the anomaly's influence met the expanding clarity of human systems. The interaction had changed. Where once there had been distortion, now there was alignment, brief, precise moments where the anomaly and the systems it touched operated under the same rules, and then, immediately after, collapse. It has to fully define something before it can remove it, the human said. That's what we've always prevented. And now you're allowing it, the Arbiter said. Yes. The pattern became clear. Terrifyingly so. You're letting it learn everything about you. Another delegate said, the realization forming in real time. Every system, every behavior, every variable. So it stops guessing, the human finished. The chamber froze again, because that was the difference. Guessing created instability. Guessing created delay. Guessing gave humanity time. Certainty removed all of that. You're eliminating the uncertainty, the Arbiter said, their voice dropping to something quieter, more focused. On purpose. Yes. Why? The human finally turned, meeting their gaze directly, because it can't fail while it's still trying to understand. A pause. It can only fail once it thinks it does. The implication hit harder than anything before it. They weren't trying to confuse the anomaly anymore. They were trying to complete its model. To give it a perfect understanding of humanity, total, absolute, without gaps or inconsistencies, so that when it acted, it would act on something that could not be simplified. The projection surged with new data as the anomaly's advance accelerated further. Entire sectors began to destabilize, not just human systems now, but neighboring regions as the phenomenon expanded its focus. The clarity radiating from humanity was acting like a beacon, drawing its attention, anchoring its behavior. Everything was converging. How long until it reaches your core systems? The Arbiter asked. The human didn't need to check. Under 10 hours. And after that, a brief pause. Everything. The words settled into the chamber with absolute finality, because if the anomaly succeeded, if it fully defined humanity and removed it without destabilizing, there would be nothing left to slow it down. No contradictions, no inconsistencies, no unknowns, just a system that understood how to erase everything it encountered. You're gambling the entire galaxy on this, a delegate said, the accusation stripped of anger, reduced to raw truth. The human nodded once. Yes, and if you're wrong. For the first time, there was no immediate answer, not because the human didn't know, but because the answer didn't change anything. Finally, he spoke. Then we were already too late. The projection flared again, brighter now, more intense, as the anomaly's focus tightened around the densest concentration of human systems, the core worlds, where the synchronization was nearing completion. Every signal was aligning. Every system was becoming perfectly, undeniably human, defined, complete. And at the center of it all, a new structure began to form. Not physical, not technological in any conventional sense, but conceptual, a convergence point where all human systems, all human identity, all human meaning was being directed. The chamber watched as it took shape, not understanding what it was, but recognizing its purpose. This was where the final interaction would occur, not at the boundary, not at the edges, at the core, and as the anomaly accelerated toward it, adapting faster with every system it consumed, one final, unavoidable question emerged. What happens when something that can erase anything it fully understands finally understands humanity completely? By the time the anomaly reached the inner systems, humanity was no longer fragmented. There were no isolated colonies left to fall one by one, no scattered signals to flicker out in sequence. Everything had been drawn inward, aligned toward a single conceptual center that now defined the entirety of human presence. What had once been billions of independent systems, identities, and perspectives had collapsed into something unified, not simplified, but intentionally complete. For the first time in their history, humanity was no longer behaving like a collection of individuals. It was behaving like a single, coherent idea. The tribunal watched as the final outer nodes disappeared, not with resistance, but with precision. Each one stabilized for a fraction of a second, perfectly defined, fully understood, and then vanished without distortion. The anomaly was no longer struggling. It was no longer hesitating. It was operating at peak efficiency, processing humanity's revealed structure with a speed that outpaced every predictive model. And still, humanity did not pull back. They continued forward. Inside the convergence point, something unprecedented was taking shape, not a weapon, not a system, but a condition, a state where every aspect of human existence was being layered into a single, inseparable whole. Memory, emotion, contradiction, history, instinct. Everything that had once existed separately now coexisted within a shared framework that resisted reduction, not through inconsistency, but through totality. There were no gaps left, no unknowns, no ambiguity. Humanity had made itself fully knowable. The anomaly reached the threshold moments later. The interaction did not resemble anything the galaxy had seen before. There was no visible boundary, no clear line of contact. Instead, the projection showed a collapse of distinction, where the anomaly's field and the human convergence began to overlap in a way that defied separation. For a brief moment, everything stabilized. Perfect clarity, perfect definition. The anomaly had what it needed. The tribunal held its breath, not out of hope, but out of inevitability. Every model, every projection, every logical outcome pointed to the same conclusion. The anomaly would process the convergence, reduce it into a stable form, and remove it entirely. Humanity would end, and then the anomaly would continue, faster, stronger, unchallenged. The first phase began exactly as expected. The convergence point locked into absolute definition. Every variable resolved, every contradiction mapped. The anomaly's influence tightened, compressing the totality of human existence into a form it could act upon. For a fraction of a second, the system was perfect, and then it broke, not violently, not catastrophically, but fundamentally. The projection flickered, not with distortion, but with excess. Data overflowed the system, not as noise, but as competing certainties that refused to collapse into a single state. The anomaly attempted to simplify, to reduce the convergence into something manageable. It couldn't, because there was nothing left to reduce. Every contradiction had already been integrated. Every inconsistency had already been resolved, not into uniformity, but into coexistence. Humanity was no longer a system of variables that could be simplified. It was a system that required contradiction to remain stable. The anomaly processed again, and failed again. The tribunal leaned forward, unable to look away as the impossible began to unfold. The field that had once erased entire fleets without resistance now hesitated, not in movement, but in function. Its processes looped, attempting to resolve a structure that did not collapse under simplification. It was encountering something new, not inconsistency, not noise, completeness. "It doesn't know what to remove," someone whispered. The human envoy did not respond. He was watching the same projection, but his expression had changed. The exhaustion that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, steadier. Recognition. Inside the convergence, the pressure intensified. The anomaly's attempts to process the system became more aggressive, cycling through patterns faster, applying its method with increasing precision. Each time, it reached the same point and stopped, because to remove any part of the system would require redefining the whole, and the whole could not be simplified without losing the structure that allowed it to exist at all. For the first time since its discovery, the anomaly had encountered a limit, but it was learning. The hesitation shortened with each cycle. The processing loops became more refined, more targeted. It was adapting, searching for a pathway through the complexity, a method to reduce what had previously been irreducible. "It's getting closer," the Arbiter said, their voice tight with the weight of what they were witnessing. "It's not stopping, it's adjusting." "Yes," the human said. There was no denial in his tone, only acknowledgement. The projection surged again as the anomaly isolated segments of the convergence, testing them individually, probing for weaknesses in the integrated structure. Small fluctuations appeared, brief instabilities, where the pressure of total definition strained the system. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. A section of the convergence began to resolve, its internal contradictions compressing under the anomaly's influence. The tribunal leaned in, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then the system reacted, not by resisting, by expanding. The resolved segment did not collapse. It reconnected, reintegrated into the larger whole, its contradictions reintroduced, its stability restored through the very complexity the anomaly was trying to eliminate. The process reset, the anomaly recalibrated, and for the first time, something else appeared within the projection. A delay, not imposed, experienced. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a fraction of a second where the anomaly's response lagged behind its input. A moment where processing did not immediately lead to action. The chamber felt it, not as data, as something closer to hesitation. "It's thinking," a delegate said, the words barely forming. The human did not correct them, because for the first time, the description fit. The anomaly was no longer just reacting. It was evaluating, and that evaluation introduced something it had never possessed before. Uncertainty. The cycle slowed, not dramatically, not enough to guarantee success, but enough to change the nature of the interaction. Each attempt to simplify the convergence now carried a cost, a delay, a recalculation, a need to reassess. The anomaly was no longer operating at perfect efficiency. It was struggling. Inside the convergence, the system held every part of humanity, every memory, every contradiction, every defining aspect, remained intact, not because it resisted removal, but because it required itself to exist. There was no simpler state to collapse into, only complexity, only meaning, and, for the first time, the anomaly was forced to exist within it. The tribunal watched as the projection stabilized, not into resolution, but into equilibrium. The anomaly and the convergence were no longer separate systems interacting at a boundary. They were overlapping, interacting continuously, changing each other. The Arbiter's voice, when it came, was quieter than it had ever been. "Is this working?" The human didn't answer immediately. He was still watching the projection, his expression steady, but his eyes reflecting something that had not been there before. Not certainty, not relief, something else. "Not yet," he said. A pause. "It hasn't finished." The words settled into the chamber with quiet finality, because the anomaly was still adapting, still processing, still learning, and if it found a way to resolve the convergence, if it discovered a method to simplify even this, then everything they had done would collapse in an instant. The projection flickered once more, the delay shortening, the cycles tightening, the anomaly pushing harder against the limits it had just encountered. And as the balance between them began to shift again, one final question emerged, sharper than all the others. What happens if something that has just learned how to hesitate learns how to choose? The moment it chose, the entire system changed. Until that point, everything the galaxy had witnessed could still be explained, barely, within the limits of logic. A phenomenon encountered resistance. A system reached a threshold. A process slowed under complexity. These were anomalies, yes, but they still followed patterns that could be analyzed, predicted, understood. Choice did not belong to that framework. Choice required something more than processing. It required preference, direction, a distinction between possibilities that could not be resolved through calculation alone. And the anomaly made one. The projection did not show the decision itself. There was no signal, no command, no definable action that marked the moment. Instead, it revealed the absence of something that had always been there. The loop stopped. Not entirely, but enough. The endless cycle of simplification attempts, the rapid recalculations, the relentless push toward reduction, all of it slowed into something deliberate. The anomaly was no longer trying to resolve the convergence immediately. It was observing it, not as a variable, as a state. The tribunal watched in stunned silence as the pressure within the system shifted. The aggressive compression that had threatened to collapse the convergence eased, replaced by a more controlled interaction that no longer sought to eliminate contradiction, but to hold it. It was subtle, terrifyingly so. "It's not failing," the arbiter said, their voice barely steady. "It's adapting again." The human envoy didn't look away from the projection. "Yes," he said quietly, "but not the way it did before." The difference became clear in the data. Where the anomaly had once isolated segments of the convergence to test and reduce them, it now allowed them to persist. Contradictions intact, unresolved, yet stable within the larger structure. It was no longer forcing a single outcome. It was maintaining multiple. The delay that had first appeared as hesitation began to evolve into something else. Not a flaw, not a limitation, a function. The anomaly was learning how to exist without resolving everything. And in doing so, it crossed a boundary no one had anticipated. It became capable of coexistence. The realization spread through the chamber like a slow, unstoppable wave. What they were witnessing was not containment restored, not destruction achieved, but transformation, something far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more profound. Because the anomaly had not been defeated, it had been changed. Inside the convergence, humanity did not disappear. It expanded. Every aspect of human identity, the contradictions, the emotions, the layered meaning that had once made them impossible to simplify, remained intact, but no longer confined to a single structure. It diffused through the anomaly, integrating not as data to be processed, but as a condition that reshaped the system itself. The boundary between the two dissolved, not into uniformity, into integration. The projection stabilized, no longer flickering with instability or overload, but displaying something that defied categorization. The region that had once been a containment zone no longer behaved like an isolated anomaly. Its influence extended outward, not as distortion, but as subtle variation, small, controlled inconsistencies that prevented systems from collapsing into perfect definition. It was balanced. Across nearby sectors, the effects became visible almost immediately. Systems that had begun to destabilize halted their progression toward erasure. Signals that had drifted toward collapse reasserted themselves, not in their original forms, but in stable, slightly altered states that retained identity without locking into rigid definition. The process did not reverse what had been lost, but it prevented further loss. The anomaly, no longer purely an anomaly, had stopped consuming. It had started maintaining. The chamber remained silent, not out of fear now, but out of something far more difficult to process. Understanding. Humanity had not contained the phenomenon again. They had not destroyed it. They had forced it to become something that could not exist without them. The Arbiter's voice, when it finally came, carried none of its earlier authority. Only awe. They're still there, they said. The human envoy allowed himself the smallest shift in expression. Not relief, not triumph, but something quieter. Recognition, yes, but not as individuals. No, a pause. Then, what are they? The human looked at the projection, where the once unstoppable force now existed in a state that balanced contradiction and coherence in equal measure. They're the reason it can't happen again, he said. The implications settled into the chamber with a weight that reshaped everything that had come before. The anomaly could no longer simplify without destabilizing itself. It could no longer erase identity without unraveling the structure that now defined it. It had learned not just how to understand, but how to stop. Across the galaxy, the ripple effects continued. Systems once at risk stabilized. Regions that had begun to exhibit early signs of collapse returned to functional states, their identities intact, their structures preserved. Not perfectly, not identically, but enough. Enough to exist. Enough to matter. The cost, however, was absolute. There were no signals from Earth, no transmissions from the core systems, no indication that the individuals who had made up humanity still existed in any form that could be separated, identified, or recovered. They had not survived, not in the way anyone else understood survival. They had become the condition that allowed everything else to continue. The Arbiter looked at the human envoy, a question forming that felt almost impossible to ask after everything that had just happened. Did they know? They asked. The human didn't hesitate. Yes. And they chose this anyway? A pause. Not long. Just long enough. Yes. Silence settled over the chamber one last time. Not empty. Not uncertain. Final. Because the galaxy had just witnessed something no civilization had ever attempted, let alone achieved. Humanity had faced something that could not be fought, could not be escaped, could not be understood through conventional means. And instead of surrendering to it, they had redefined it, not through dominance, not through destruction, but through something far more difficult. They had forced it to change, and in doing so, they had ensured that no matter how advanced, how powerful, or how inevitable a threat might seem, there would always be one variable it could never fully eliminate: humanity, not as a species, but as a principle. And as the projection dimmed, stabilizing into a quiet, balanced state that no longer threatened to erase what it touched, the final realization settled into every mind in that chamber. The warnings had never been about what humanity would do to the galaxy. They had been about what the galaxy might force humanity to become.